Welcome to this presentation titled A Dialogue on Political Economy, Feminine Voices. I am Edward J. Dodson. This presentation highlights the contributions of 15 women to the study of the human condition reflected in their life's work and in their writings. In this presentation, through the responses to questions I put to them, I explore their positions relating to the principles that ought to guide us in the quest for the just society. The women selected here are in alphabetical order: Hannah Arendt, Margaret Bateman, Catherine Drinker Bowen, Anna George DeMille, Emma Goldman, Patricia Heder Kelso, Mildred Loomis, Helen Taylor Mill, Ayn Rand, Joan Robinson, Ida M. Tarbell, Barbara Tuchman, Beatrice Webb, Mary Wollstonecraft, and Cecil Whittam Smith. Let me take a few minutes to introduce you to these remarkable women. Hannah Arendt was born in 1906 into a secular family of German Jews. She studied philosophy at the University of Marburg. She was prevented from qualifying for a professorship when the National Socialists gained power in Germany and was briefly imprisoned in 1933. Shortly after her release, she left Germany, briefly working at the League of Nations in Geneva, then moving to Paris. In 1940, she was interned as an enemy alien by the Vichy government in southern France. Along with her husband and mother, she was assisted by a U.S. diplomat in acquiring a visa to travel to the United States. In 1959, she was named the first female lecturer at Princeton, then moved on to the University of Chicago, where she also became a member of the Committee on Social Thought. In 1958, her book, The Human Condition, was published. Margaret Bateman was born in Canada, where she eventually encountered the ideas contained in the works of Henry George, completing courses at the Henry George School in Montreal. By 1938, she was elected to the board of the Montreal School of Economic Science and was serving as associate editor of The Square Deal. Her most penetrating written work, Who Owns the Earth, was published in 1938. When the Second World War began, she was recruited to take over as director of the Henry George School of Social Science in New York City, a position she held until 1946. Catherine Drinker Bowen was born in 1897 to a prominent Quaker family. She studied music at the Peabody Institute and the Juilliard School, but chose writing as her career. She had no formal academic training, but became a respected biographer. At the time of her death in 1973, she was working on a biography of Benjamin Franklin, which was published posthumously. Miracle at Philadelphia was published in 1966. Emma Goldman was born in 1869 in Lithuania. She emigrated to the United States in 1885, where she soon came to embrace the anarchist political philosophy. Her subsequent involvement in an attempted assassination of Henry Clay Frick resulted in a prison sentence of 22 years. In 1906, she founded the journal Mother Earth. In 1917, she was sentenced to 2 years in prison for conspiring to, quote, induce persons not to register, quote, for the military draft. After her release, she was rearrested, along with hundreds of others, and deported to Russia. She later denounced the Bolsheviks for their violent repression of independent voices. In 1923, her book, My Disillusionment in Russia, was published. She later produced an autobiography, then made her way to Spain to support the revolution there. Patricia Heder was a longtime collaborator with Louis Kelso in the effort to promote universal capitalism. They eventually married. In 1967, they co-authored the book How to Turn 80 Million Workers into Capitalists on Borrowed Money. In 1987, their book Democracy and Economic Power, Extending the Aesop Revolution, was published. Mildred Loomis was born in 1900. She became a writer, educator, and homesteader, sometimes called the grandmother of the counterculture. She settled at the School of Living soon after it was started by Ralph Borsodi in 1936. After teaching there for several years, she moved with her husband John Loomis to Brookville, Ohio. The School of Living was relocated to the Loomis homestead in 1945. She became the editor of the school's newsletter, Green Revolution. She also served for 40 years as the school's director. Helen Taylor, born in 1831, was an English feminist and writer. She was the stepdaughter of John Stuart Mill. After Mill's death, she entered public life in support of social and political reforms. Her principles were at once democratic and strongly individualist, but she favored what she deemed practical in the socialist program. The causes of land nationalization and the taxation of land values appealed to her, and she became a leading member of the League for Taxing Land Values. Henry George described her as, quote, one of the most intelligent women I ever met, if not the most intelligent. Anna George DeMille, daughter of Henry George, was born in 1878. She became an ardent supporter of her father's crusade for social and economic justice. In 1926, she was elected as one of the founding directors of the Robert Schockenbach Foundation. Then, with the establishment in 1932 of the Henry George School of Social Science, she was elected the school's first president. She authored numerous articles and frequently lectured on the political economy of her father, including a 1946 lecture tour of African American colleges in the southern United States. Ayn Rand Eliza Rosenbaum was born in Russia in 1905. At age 16, she entered Petrograd State University, graduating in 1924. In 1925, she was granted a visa to visit relatives in the United States. Eventually, she decided to remain in the United States and to pursue her career in Hollywood, California. Ayn Rand came to embrace the moral principles she described as objectivism. Her best-known works were novels, The Fountainhead, published in 1943, and Atlas Shrugged, published in 1957. Joan Robinson was born in 1903 and became a strong voice in Britain for post-Keynesian economic analysis. She studied economics at Girton College, Cambridge. Immediately after graduation in 1925, she married fellow economist Austin Robinson. In 1937, she was appointed a lecturer in economics at the University of Cambridge. In 1965, she was appointed a full professor and fellow of Girton College. Ida Tarbell was born in 1857 in Erie County, Pennsylvania. She began her career as a teacher in Ohio, but after 2 years she returned to Pennsylvania, where she went to work as a writer for the Chautauquan, a teaching supplement for home study. In 1886, she became managing editor. In 1890, Tarbell moved to Paris to do postgraduate work in historical research. Her book, History of Standard Oil Company, published in 1904, set in motion the litigation resulting in the breakup of the Standard Oil Trust. Barbara Tuchman was born in 1912. Her father owned The Nation magazine. After earning a Bachelor of Arts from Radcliffe College in 1933, she worked as a volunteer research assistant at the Institute of Pacific Relations, spending a year in Tokyo during 1934-35. During this time, she contributed to The Nation as a correspondent. Out of her coverage of the Spanish Civil War, her first book, The Lost British Policy, Britain and Spain since 1700, was published in 1938. She won the Pulitzer Prize for her book on the First World War, The Guns of August, published in 1963, and received a second Pulitzer in 1972 for her biography of General Joseph Stilwell. Beatrice Webb was born in 1858 in Stanish, Gloucestershire. In her youth, she was strongly influenced by the philosophy of Herbert Spencer and by the cooperative movement. In 1892, she married Sidney Webb. The Webbs became active members of the Fabian Society. With the support of the Fabians, Beatrice Webb co-authored books and pamphlets on socialism and the cooperative movement, including The History of Trade Unionism, 1894, and Industrial Democracy, 1897. Mary Wollstonecraft, born in 1759 in England, emerged as a major feminine voice with her 1792 book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And finally, Cecil Woodham Smith was born in 1896 in Wales. She graduated from St. Hilda's College, Oxford, with a degree in English in 1917. Her first book as a historian, a biography of Florence Nightingale, was published in 1950. The Reason Why was published in 1953, examining the consequences of Britain's rentier-dominated society as played out during Britain's involvement in the Crimean War and the famous charge of the Light Brigade. I begin by asking Anna George DeMille, daughter of the well-known political economist Henry George, to comment on the challenges we face in our quest for the establishment of just societies. She responds, "People are thinking as they have not thought for decades. We must reach them now while they are groping for understanding and help. It is our supreme opportunity. It means tremendous work, boring, fatiguing work, requiring patience and tact. Our enthusiasm must not make us intolerant or didactic. We must not demand that our program be adopted overnight, or even that the understanding of it be made overnight. I take it you are as committed as was your father to the solutions he embraced, to the public collection of the rent of land as the means to achieve a fair and just distribution of wealth." Yes, of course, I can do no better than to remind everyone here today what was written by Aldous Huxley in The Foreword to Brave New World. He said, "If I were now to rewrite the book, I would offer a third alternative, the possibility of sanity. Economics would be decentralist and Henry Georgian." Yes, your father's body of work over the last quarter of the 19th century almost changed the course of history. Certainly, his description of conditions in Ireland ignited a profound public reaction. Perhaps Cecil Woodham Smith can provide some insight given her detailed analysis of events in Ireland during the 19th century. In 1844, Ireland presented the extraordinary spectacle of a country in which wages and employment, practically speaking, did not exist. For these people, there was no possibility of escaping starvation except the land, and land became like gold in Ireland. Without doubt, Ireland provides a dramatic example of the worst conditions possible. In the late 19th century, the land question in Ireland was a burning issue. The Irish peasants, ground down by poverty and oppressed by their landlords, most of whom were absentee owners, were being subjected to widespread eviction. One could argue that the land question, though hidden below the surface once Ireland became an independent republic, has never been appropriately addressed. I see that Hannah Arendt would like to add to what has been said so far. More universally, poverty forces the free man to act like a slave. Proudhon's dictum that property is theft has a solid basis of truth in the origins of modern capitalism. It is all the more significant that even Proudhon hesitated to accept the doubtful remedy of general expropriation, because he knew quite well that the abolition of private property, what might cure the evil of poverty, was only too likely to invite the greater evil of tyranny. Yes, but Proudhon's views on property are framed by his disdain for the state and his desire to foster the growth of decentralized, self-sufficient communities. Thus, he makes an interesting proposal regarding the redistribution of land rents. He writes, What is called economic rent in agriculture has no other cause than the inequality in the quality of the land. Without this inequality, there would be no economic rent, since there would be no means of comparison. Therefore, if anybody has a claim on account of this inequality, it is not the state, but the other land workers who hold inferior land. Mildred Loomis asked to join our discussion. Ms. Loomis. In Israel, a similar move has been widely implemented. The Jewish National Fund has been buying and holding title to land since 1948, making it available to groups of settlers on long-term leases. Instead of selling the land or giving title to individuals and groups, the land remains the property of the fund in the name of all the people, free from speculative landlordism. Thus, land users get a start without the prohibitive cost of buying land. A wide variety of Israeli communities and specific holding agreements have developed, but in recent years the trend is toward group trust holding of land and individual and family holding of buildings and produced goods. This gives a balance of individual and communal interests so necessary to a healthy growth of both individual persons and community interaction. But not without controversy. By 2007, the fund owned 13% of the total land in Israel. Constructively, the fund has paid for the planting over 200 million trees in Israel, has built 180 dams and reservoirs, has developed 250,000 acres of land, and established more than 1,000 parks. Yet, discrimination against Arabs and certain fundraising tactics have immersed the fund in numerous political and legal disputes. It is clear that community ownership of land does not automatically bring prosperity to all its members. As the saying goes, the devil is in the details. As my father said in the speech he delivered in 1889 at the International Conference for Land and Social Reform in Paris, the land question is the bottom question. It is the starting point for all reforms. Land monopoly is the primary cause of poverty. Yet there are some societies where the ownership of land is widely held. Is this not a mitigating factor where poverty is concerned? In my time, I traveled extensively on the European continent. Unlike the people of Ireland, the Norwegians appeared to enjoy all the blessings of freedom. There were only 2 counts in the whole country who had estates and exacted some feudal observances from their tenantry. All the rest of the country was divided into small farms which belonged to the cultivator. Much has changed over the last 2 centuries in Norway. Only about 3% of the land is good for agriculture, and private ownership prevails. Thus, farms are generally small. There are fairly strict regulations in place to minimize foreign ownership of land, and farms must be owner-operated. Norway imposes very low taxes on either the rent of land or its capitalized value. There is a tax on wealth, but because of low assessments of residential property values, the amount of revenue collected is very low. Back in 1938, I surveyed the ownership of land around the world. The most unique story came from Denmark. This tiny principality has known feudalism in its worst sense. In 1939, Denmark celebrated the 150th anniversary of the emancipation of the peasants. During those 150 years, the country had taken gradual steps toward a better social system. Copenhagen, the capital, had no slums, since a large part of land rent was collected by the government. There was no illiteracy in Denmark. Of the farms, 85% were electrified. There were paved roads all over the country. Practically every home had a library. There was a radio to every 6 or 7 persons, a motor car to every 30, and a telephone to every 10. All this in a country where natural resources are limited. The farming season is short, the size of the nation too small to exert much influence on international trade. In Britain, the corresponding proposal to take over property and land has often been advocated. The longer it is put off, the greater the unearned increment of private wealth. The obvious conclusion being that the concentrated control over the land of any society results in serious social and economic problems. So do I understand you to argue that nationalization of land, or at least some system of land reform, is a necessary component of any attempt to form a just society? The large fortunes built up during the process of accumulation, as well as those inherited from feudalism, have left a permanent legacy of great inequality of property. It perpetuates itself, for one finds it easy to make money if one has some, and next to impossible if one has not. Why is this not widely recognized and acknowledged? How is it that entrenched landed privilege goes unchallenged? As a socialist, I saw a growing uneasiness, amounting to conviction that the industrial organization, which has yielded rent, interest, and profits on a stupendous scale, had failed to provide a decent livelihood and tolerable conditions for a majority of the inhabitants of Great Britain. As a strong proponent of capitalism, I reached a different conclusion. The world crisis of today is a moral crisis, and nothing less than a moral revolution can resolve it. A moral revolution to sanction and complete the political achievement of the American Revolution. And yet, in your writings, Ms. Rand, you are silent on the distinctions made by Franklin, Paine, and Jefferson between property in production and property in land. How, in your opinion, is the land of any society to be allocated to its citizens? A notable example of the proper method of establishing private ownership from scratch in a previously ownerless area is the Homestead Act of 1862, by which the U.S. government opened the western frontier for settlement and turned public land over to private owners. Although that land was originally regarded in law as public property, the method of its allocation, in fact, followed the proper principle, but not in explicit ideological intention. The citizens did not have to pay the government as if it were an owner. Ownership began with them, and they earned it by the method which is the source and root of the concept of property. By working on unused material resources, by turning a wilderness into a civilized settlement. Frontiers are not endless. Nations run out of land to allocate to homesteaders, and a secondary market arises, yielding gains to those who were the first arrivals, and more often than not to speculators with strong political connections. Do these outcomes meet an objective test of justice? In Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, I wrote, "The moral justification of capitalism lies in the fact that it is the only system consonant with man's rational nature, that it protects man's survival qua man, and that its ruling principle is justice." What is justice then for those who come later, after the land has been claimed and even worked by those who arrived or were born earlier? Capitalism requires equality of opportunity, and equality of opportunity requires securing and protecting our most fundamental right as a human being, our equal birthright to the earth. America's founding fathers themselves fixed their attention on political power, which they wanted to wrest from Great Britain in order to more fully exploit and enjoy the economic power they had already obtained thanks to their early arrival, fortunate connections, and the virgin opportunities of a largely uninhabited continent. With so much empty or nearly empty land to exploit, why would they choose to sever ties with a government with which they had so many cultural ties? Charles Beard attributes their action to America's unique economic circumstances. He wrote, "There was no established clergy here. There was no titled aristocracy. There was not such proletariat as formed the mob of Paris. Land was the chief form of property, and its wide distribution among the whites brought about, in fact, a considerable economic equality to correspond to the theory of political equality. It is worth pointing out that Jefferson thought it would take several centuries for the population to grow and spread across the continent. Instead, this happened in just 2 generations following his death in 1826. The prevailing economic democracy was, in a sense, an accident. It was the result of the high productiveness of labor and a low technology economy, the plentifulness of cheap land, and the enormous need for labor to make the land productive. All 3 of these conditions were temporary. The outcome was evident by the time I began my research into the Standard Oil Trust. Through the use of machinery, the manufacturer had learned how to double, treble, or even more greatly multiply his output. He had been taking full advantage of every new labor-saving device with little regard or no regard to its effect on either markets or labor. As we look around the world today, surely we should all realize that in future years our minds and energies must be devoted to the task of making this one world of ours a world in which every human being will have the necessities of life. The only place from which these necessities can be obtained is Mother Earth. And the consequences of the current state of affairs? When Mother Earth is monopolized, human beings have no other alternative than to work for the lowest wages that monopoly dictates. We have seen that where ground rent is taken for the public treasury and the monopoly of land even partially corrected, conditions have improved. When men are prevented from reaching into the earth's storehouse because others claim the sole right to that storehouse, we reap the consequences and world chaos. I am not convinced this is true. I believe that wealth represents goods that have been produced but not consumed. The government has no source of revenue except the taxes paid by the producers. Does the owner of land as owner produce anything that can be consumed? You may not realize it, but your definition of wealth is the definition given by Henry George. Is that not correct, Ms. DeMille? Yes, goods we produce, which leaves nature as the source of wealth, but not wealth to individuals. Nature is our commons from which wealth is taken. If the earth were open to them on equal terms, men would not have to look for jobs. Jobs would be waiting for men. Taxes, as we know them, would disappear. Free enterprise would flourish. Wages would increase as production increased, and once again men would be free to carve out their destinies, as our forefathers did when they found free land in America. If only that had occurred, centralizing ownership of land, property, and factories into fewer and fewer hands meant transforming individual owners into wage and salary earners, totally dependent upon others for their employment and livelihood. In the present state of society, it appears necessary to go back to first principles in search of the most simple truths, and to dispute with some prevailing prejudice every inch of ground. I have concluded, as did Keynes, that if there is any law governing the distribution of income between classes, it still remains to be discovered. We have a long history of the search for the first principles referred to by Mary Wollstonecraft. Yet Joan Robinson is dismissive of the contributions made by the political economists of Henry George's generation and earlier. The purpose of studying economics is not to acquire a set of ready-made answers to economic questions, but to learn how to avoid being deceived by economists. Because at least some economists work in defense of existing orthodoxy, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that accepted theory and ideas are flawed. There must be more equality established in society, or morality will never gain ground. And this virtuous equality will not rest firmly, even when founded on a rock, if one half of mankind are chained to its bottom by fate, for they will be continually undermining it through ignorance or pride. We are at a vital point now. Civilization is standing with her back against the wall. It is for us who know the way to fight as we have never fought before. And whether we decide at this roundtable discussion what is the common denominator, we can each and all return to our homes with renewed enthusiasm and strength for our own particular solo work. What needs to be studied are social institutions themselves as they actually existed, whatever be the motive of the man and woman concerned. Whether competitive profit making or capitalism promotes greed and oppression and depresses public spirit, like the analogous accusations that state employment favors slackness and lessens initiative, all alike are questions to be investigated. Whatever the source of moral knowledge might be, divine commandments or moral reason, every sane man, it was assumed, carried within himself a voice that tells him what is right and what is wrong, and this regardless of the law of the land and regardless of the voices of his fellow men. Even so, we often behave in ways we know are inconsistent with his voice telling us what is right and what is wrong. Exactly so. Again, remember what occurred in Ireland during the 19th century. It was existence on the lowest scale. As the population increased, the continual subdivision of farms into patches brought the landlord higher and still higher rents, and the potato patches of Ireland first equaled what the rich farmlands of England fetched in rent and then went higher. Men bid against each other in desperation, and on paper the landlords of Ireland grew rich, but the rents were not paid, could not be paid. Yet not even the people of Ireland fully comprehended that ending absentee landlordism would not solve their deep social, political, and economic problems. Departure proved to be the rational response. One escape route was across the Atlantic Ocean to North America. It was natural for Europeans to speculate about this vast, unpenetrated continent. The very exaggerations held an element of truth. Few men saw as yet the physical potential, the almost limitless resources for wealth and material expansion. Here was indeed an asylum, a refuge for the downtrodden. Millions of immigrants came. They were told it was the land of inexhaustible resources, forever productive soil, forests, mines. As the ambitious and oppressed of Europe arrived, businesses flourished, cities grew, and wealth piled up. America in 1787 was on the verge, the very brink of industrial and scientific expansion. Over the mountains poured the settlers, following the wilderness road through the Cumberland Gap. It is hard to gauge the numbers. There was no census until 1790, but the over-mountain population, which in 1775 numbered only a few thousand, by 1790 would reach more than 110,000. Just a century later, my father addressed a large meeting in New York City on the sad state of living conditions experienced by mostly immigrant families. He said, "You can turn the east side with its tenements into the most beautiful part of the city, and the results will be that our millionaires will soon be living there. Where are the people turned out from those houses to go? Into the streets, into the police stations that this very night are crowded, or into the almshouses? One class presses on another, for all are aiming to procure respect on account of their property, and property once gained will procure the respect due only to talents and virtue. Men neglect the duties incumbent on man, yet are treated like demigods." It is conceived by all radical thinkers that the fundamental cause of this terrible state of affairs is 1. That man must sell his labor, 2. That his inclination and judgment are subordinated to the will of a master. To the 18th century, property gave a man a stake in society, made him responsible, worthy of a vote and a voice in government. The true foundation of Republican government, wrote Thomas Jefferson, is the equal right of every citizen in his person and in his property. In the American states, Jefferson said further, everyone may have land to labor for himself if he chooses, and everyone by his property or by his satisfactory situation is interested in the support of law and order. Thomas Jefferson hoped that most Americans would become and remain self-sufficient owners of farmland, yet even Jefferson eventually came to recognize the need for and importance of industry and commerce. Still, he held to his vision of a future without masters. By his property or by his satisfactory situation, Jefferson owned, at one time or another, about 10,000 acres and from 1 to 2,000 Negroes. The pursuit of happiness did not start from scratch. What I learned from my father's research is this simple fact. Wages are high in new countries where the land is free. But in the old countries where land is monopolized, wages are low and poverty is great. Had Jefferson lived, he would have had to face this realization of a deterministic future. Unless economic rent or the return for the use of the land should be collected and employed for social needs, and that no taxes at all should be levied on the products of labor. Henry George would not be surprised to learn that from 1825 to 1920, the percentage of farms operated by their owners had been cut in half, declining about 4% per year. By 1970, 3/4 of the land was owned by persons other than those who lived on it and cultivated it. Our past will be for us a burden beneath which we can only collapse for as long as we refuse to understand the present and fight for a better future. Only then, but from that moment on, will the burden become a blessing, that is, a weapon in the battle for freedom. It seems that neither the Keynesian nor the Marxian prognosis of the future of capitalism is being fulfilled, and we are left without any particular theory as to what will happen next. I would argue we do have much more than a theory to rely on. We have a long history of boom to bust cycles, all driven to some degree by our dysfunctional property markets. A number of economists have grasped this fact, including Mary Cleveland at Columbia University. She writes, land bubbles of varying severity and universality recur roughly every 18 to 20 years. A few prominent economists recognize the bubble's threat, but most economists didn't see the crisis coming until it ran over them. A great deal of highly expert manpower is devoted to advising rentiers and businessmen on legal tax avoidance, not to mention the other kind. The legislative, administrative, and legal apparatus of any country is burdened with the task of making the tax system fair, or appear fair. In spite of it all, inequality remains. Progressive taxation has made scarcely a dent in it. Right, as we have heard repeatedly by former World Bank economist Joseph Stiglitz. As he puts it, our systems of law and taxation have secured and protected rent-seeking behavior over the actual production of goods or wealth. Government has sought to discharge its responsibility for the health and prosperity of the economy through coerced trickle-down. In other words, through redistribution achieved by the rigging of labor prices, by taxation to support redistribution and job creation, or subsidization by inflation, and by all kinds of welfare, open and concealed. We are nearing the end of our available time for what has been a robust and illuminating exchange. We could spend much more time on the whole issue of income and wealth redistribution. For example, if Henry George's analysis describes what actually occurs in the real world, and I conclude it does, then what we experience is a redistribution of wealth from producers to non-producing rentiers. As the one economics professor participating in this roundtable, I would like to offer a remedy, although perhaps a drastic remedy. The concept of the nation as rentier points the way out of this situation. Concentrations of private property could be wiped out in a generation by confiscatory death duties, leaving a reasonable life interest to widows and orphans, and buttressed by equally heavy taxation on gifts. The titles to property could be handed over in the form in which it exists, to be held like any other endowment of a trust, and the income from it devoted to public purposes. This would not merely check the growth of rentier income, as nationalization with compensation does, but take a huge bite out of it. Food for thought and for a later time. And as is always the case with such proposals, the devil is in the details, a sentiment with which everyone here today would hopefully concur. And with that, thank you all for your participation in this roundtable.